have the great privilege to now introduce our next guest, Dr. Eric Hobsbawm. He has been actually absolutely key for our interview marathon. His whole idea and motto of a protest against forgetting was a great inspiration for the first marathon in 2006. Eric Hobsbawm is one of the world's leading historians. He was in Berlin when Hitler came to power and has ever since been a Marxist, specializing in the period 1789 to 1914, the long 19th century. His most well-known work is The Age of Revolution, The Age of Capital, The Age of Empire, the famous trilogy. He then wrote a postscript, The Age of Extremes, about the short 20th century, of which most he has witnessed himself. Eric Hobsbawm's most recent book, as I said, has just come out. And he initially said that he'd like Tino Segal, this to be a conversation. But we are so excited that now, in the last couple of days, he's actually written a text which he's going to read. So we start with his text, and we'll then open it to question. Eric Hobsbawm also said that he has read more manifestos than is good for any 91-year-old man. A very warm welcome to Eric Hobsbawm.
Most of the participants here have written manifestos. I've no manifesto to propound, and I don't think I ever drafted a document under that name, although I've drafted similar things. However, I've been reading documents called manifestos for the best part of a century, and I suppose that gives me some credibility as a commentator today. I started my intellectual life at school in Berlin at the age of 15 with one manifesto, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. I have a press photograph of me in my 80s reading the Italian journal Il Manifesto. Because my parents were married in Zurich during World War I, among Lenin and the Dadaists of the Cabaret Voltaire, I would like to think that a Dadaist manifesto issued a loud fart at the moment of my conception. But unfortunately, the first Dadaist manifesto was recited 3 months before this could have happened. Actually, systematic manifesto readers are a 20th century species. There had been plenty of collective statements, mainly religious and political in earlier centuries, but they went under different labels. There were, for instance, the Great Declarations, the Declaration of Independence of the USA, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, but probably these, while they're still around, they still survive mostly under very official auspices like the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. How will manifestos survive the 21st centuries? Political parties and movements aren't what they were in the last century, and they were, after all, one of the two great producers of manifestos. The arts were the other. Again, with the rise of business society and the MBA jargon, they have been largely replaced by that appalling invention, the mission statement. None of the mission statements I've come across says anything worth saying unless you're a fan of badly written platitudes. You can't walk more than a few yards through the undergrowth of print without stubbing your toe on some example, almost universally empty in sentiment, telling you the equivalent of "have a nice day" and "your call is important to us." Still, manifestos are competing quite successfully with mission statements. There are almost 20 million potential clicks under this heading on Google, and even allowing for the fact that many of them refer to manifesto records, this still leaves plenty. I can't say they all live up to the dictionary definition, which is, as you know, a public declaration of principles, policies, or intentions, especially of a political nature, or I might add, of any nature, because among the ones that I've looked at, they include a breastfeeding manifesto, a wildlife gardening manifesto, a manifesto for the hills, which deals with livestock in the Scots Highlands, and a rather tempting manifesto for a new walking culture by Rights and Sights, with plenty of reference to Dadaist situationists André Breton and Brecht, but rather surprisingly, none to that typical champion of the urban walkers or flaneurs, Walter Benjamin. And of course, they include all the manifestos in this marathon. I haven't had a chance to hear many of these, but one thing that strikes me about the list is that so many of the ones this weekend are individual statements, and not like almost all manifestos in the past, group statements, representing some collective we, formally organized or not. Certainly, that was the case of all political manifestos I can think of. They always speak in the plural and aim to win supporters, also in the plural. That is also the case traditionally in the arts. Ever since the futurists introduced the word into the world of art in 1909, thanks to Marinetti's Italian gift of the rhetorical gag. In doing so, I think they probably beat the French to it by a few years. I'm certain that the Cubists would have liked to invent the M word, but they were not very political at that time and better at thinking in paint than in words. Now, when I talk of art manifestos, I'm thinking primarily of avant-gardes which recognize themselves at the time, not of labels and schools which are created retrospectively, like post-impressionism, or the ones invented by critics and increasingly by dealers like abstract expressionism. I'm thinking of real groups of people, sometimes built around a person or a periodical, however shortly, conscious of what they are against and of what they think they have in common. Dadaists, surrealists, the style, left, or, take a local example, the independent group round which pop art emerged in this country in the 1950s. Or, for that matter, the original photographers' collective Magnum. If you like, they are all campaigning bodies. I'm not sure what purely individual manifestos are there for, other than one person's fears for the present and hopes for the future, which they may or may not hope is shared by others. How is this to be realized? Is it primarily by self-cultivation and shared experience, as Vivienne Westwood tells us in her rather attractive manifesto? How else? The futurists invented public self-advertisement. It's a sign of our disintegrating and chaotic society that media publicity is today the first thing that comes into a potential manifestant's mind rather than the traditional way of collective action. Of course, individuals may also use manifestos to advertise their brand. The word, you may remember, has already been mentioned here, some kind of innovation or some kind of characteristic. And then there are also, I'm sorry to say, the terrorist manifestos along the lines pioneered by the Unabomber in 1995, which advertise an individual attempt to change society. In the Unabomber's case, by sending incendiary bombs to selected enemies. I'm not sure whether this belongs into the fields of conceptual art or politics or both. It has since had some scary success in the suicide videos of terrorists. And one shouldn't actually joke about it, but these must also be regarded in their own way as individual manifestos as well as hoping to be collective. And yet there is also another purely individualist manifesto or ego trip that has nobody in mind at all except the solipsist who issues it. The extreme example of this, you may remember, is that extraordinary document, Yves Klein's Chelsea Hotel Manifesto of 1961. Klein, as some of you may know, had built a career on painting a single color, an immediately recognizable dark blue, nothing else. He painted it on square and oblong canvases, on anything three-dimensional, mostly sponges, but also on models whom he got to roll in that paint. The manifesto explains that this was because he was haunted by the blue sky. Although I must say Klein's blue is as uncerulean a color as I've ever seen. As he lay on the beach in Nice, he tells us in his manifesto, I quote, I began to feel hatred for the birds which flew back and forth across my blue cloudless sky because they tried to bore holes in my greatest and most beautiful work. Birds must be eliminated. I don't have to tell you that Klein found critics to explain his profundity and dealers to sell him to the punters. He has been given the sort of immortality he deserved by the Gagosian Gallery, which has copyrighted his manifesto. This brings me to the contents of the manifestos of my lifetime. The first thing that strikes me, looking back on them, is that the real interest in these documents is not in what they actually call for. Most of that tends to be either obvious, even platitudinous, and large landfill sites could be made to overflow with such stuff. Or else it is destined for rapid obsolescence. This is true even of the great and inspiring Communist Manifesto, which remains so alive that in the last 10 years it has been rediscovered, unfortunately not by the left, which no longer exists as a significant force, but by the businessmen whose world it predicted so successfully. The reason we read it today is the same that made me read it when I was 15. It's a wonderful, irresistible style and verve of the text, but chiefly it is a soaring analytical vision of world change in the first few pages. Most of what the Communist Manifesto actually recommended is of purely historical interest, and most readers skip it, except for the clarion call at the end. Remember, the workers have nothing to lose except their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all countries unite. Unfortunately, even this is also well past its sell-by date. Of course, that is a trouble about the future, about any writings about the future. The future is unknowable. We know what we don't like about the present and why, which is why all the manifestos are best at denunciation, even if they're no good at analysis. The ones that are good at analysis are the ones worth reading, and just as the ones that are good in style are the ones worth reading. As for the future, the only thing we know about it, that is absolutely certain about it, is that what we do with or without manifestos behind us will have unintended consequences. But we can still do it, and we can still hope, and we must. If all this is true of so permanent a text as the Communist Manifesto, it's even more true of manifestos in the creative arts. For a lot of artists, as an American jazz player once told me in a nightclub, words are not my instrument. Even when they are, as among poets, even among the very bright ones, creation doesn't follow the path I think and therefore I write. But it follows a much less controllable, much more intuitive path in which intellect enters in a different way. That, if I may say so, is a trouble with conceptual art. It starts with ideas. But intellectually, the ideas in conceptual art are usually uninteresting, unless they can be read as jokes, like Duchamp's Urinal, or, in my mind, much more fun, Paul Klee. As for the results, we still argue about them, and I don't wish to join the argument. So, reading manifestos in the arts for their intended meaning is a frustrated experience, except maybe as a performance. And even then, they are better as wit and jokes than in the oratorical mode. This is probably why Dada, that style for stand-up comics, is still the standby of so many manifestos today. Its humor is both funny and black, and like surrealism, it doesn't call for interpretations, but for the imagination to play. And that is, after all, the foundation of creative work, the play of the imagination. And anyway, the test of the pudding is not the description of the dish on the restaurant menu, however flowery, but what is produced, the eating of it. But this is where the creators in the arts have been much more successful than their manifestos. In my history of the 20th century, the age of extremes, I wrote, excuse me for quoting myself, why brilliant fashion designers, a notoriously non-analytic breed, sometimes succeed in anticipating the shape of things to come better than professional predictors, is one of the most obscure questions in history, and for the historian of the arts, one of the most central. I still don't know the answer. Looking back at the arts in the last decade before 1914, we can see how much they anticipated the breakdown of bourgeois civilization after 1914. Who knows whether a historian writing 50 years hence may say the same about what is happening in the arts, or what is today given the name of the arts, in our moment of capitalist crisis and retreat for the rich civilizations of the West. Like in the film Man on Wire, but much more uneasily, the arts walk the tightrope between soul and market, between individual and collective creation, even between recognizable and identifiable human creative products and their engulfment by technology, algorithms, and the all-embracing noise of the internet. Where do we go? On the whole, late capitalism has provided a good living for more creative people than ever before. But Fortunately, it hasn't made them satisfied either with their situation or with society. They fear and they hope. What anticipations will the historian of 2060 read into the cultural production for the past 30 years? I don't know, and I can't know. But there'll be a few manifestos on the way. Thank you.
Many thanks, Eric Hobsbawm, for this extraordinary text. And as I said, we initially had planned a dialogue, and as Eric wrote this extraordinary text, which I thought we're now going to do both and instead of either or, instead of no. So I'm going to ask him a few questions, and we then open it to the floor for your questions you'd like to ask Eric Hobsbawm. One of the things I wanted to ask is, in our last interview, we talked about the future, and you said the problem is what the future will be like. Since then, you have published this book, which has just come out, Globalization, Democracy and Terrorism, which is a lot about the 21st century. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this book, and I'll have then two more questions.
Well, even though historians deal with the past, hardly anybody can resist speculating about what's going to happen. But I try and avoid too much speculation, because I try, as a historian, to see how the past has created the predicament and the problems of the present. Behind all the things I write in the book is the present phase of globalization, which may actually, I hope, be coming to an end with the crisis, the world economic crisis through which we are now living. That globalization, the so-called speaking, it was in some sense a rule by religious fundamentalists, except that they believed in the free market rather than in God. Some of them may also believe in God, but that's not so usual among economists. It produced enormous inequalities, which are now coming home to roost, within countries as much as between countries, and it produced an unusual instability of the world system. Until this year, until last year, hardly anybody in our happy Western countries, where we live like princes compared with what happens in places like India or Asia, or at least the majority of the population, we weren't affected by it. We had these ups and downs of the stock exchange, but we didn't know what a real depression was like, whereas in Brazil, they knew in the 1980s, in Mexico, they knew in the 1990s, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in Russia, they knew in the late 1990s, in Argentina, they knew almost consistently, especially in the early 2000s. Now we also know. My only predictions on that, I think, would be that this will slow down the process of globalization, though it won't stop it. Historically, it hasn't been stopped. But it will change it. I hope it will also change it. Now, A lot of the book is concerned with the Americans. I'm not really making a prediction about the decline of the American empire, because predictions are senseless unless there's some kind of time scale attached to them. But it's fairly evident now that America, the idea on which America based its policies, namely that they could be single-handed the lords of the world, was never on. And in various pieces in my book, I demonstrate that this was never on and couldn't be, that the nature of the American empire is quite different in this respect from other empires. For one thing, it has, except for being the greatest debtor in the world, which is very unusual for empires to be, it has no specific economic interest in the way in which the British Empire. It goes not with, but in some sense against the development of the world economy. However, by that. I don't want to go on talking about this because if you...
Got two more questions and then we open it up to the floor. Actually, one thing I wanted to ask you, in our last conversation you talked about the long waves, the long waves
yes.
in the economic cycle, and now obviously that was before the credit crunch. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, Wallerstein, in his seminal book Utopistics, says that it's now going to be a 50-year transition, really, of trying to get rid of the current system, of the market economy, and trying to find an alternative. So he predicts a sort of a 50-year turmoil almost, and then maybe a new system. Would you agree with that, or what would be your view?
I think we ought to get out of that 20th century habit of thinking systems as being, as it were, mutually exclusive. You're either socialist or you're capitalist or whatever. There are plenty of people who think so. I think very few attempts have been made to build a system on the total assumption of social ownership and social management. The Soviet system at its peak tried that. And in the past 20, 30 years, the capitalist system has also tried it in various cases. In both cases, the results demonstrate that it won't work. So it seems to me the problem isn't whether a market system disappears, but exactly what the nature of the mixture between market economy and public economy is, and above all, in my view, what are the social objectives of that economy. One of the worst things about the politics of the past 30 years is that the rich have forgotten to be afraid of the poor, of most of the people in the world, which is why they've gone on behaving in this extraordinary public, luxurious fashion, throwing about the zillions. I think perhaps this is now, I hope, going to come, if not to an end, at least going to be a little bit modified.
And fear leads us to my last question. In our interview last year, you were saying that you also feel this pressure, actually, of environmental forces to major change. Now, in our Manifesto Marathon, we've had a lot of manifestos which had to do with this, knowledge the environment. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this.
There's no question about it that the problem of the environment is a central problem. It's not the only central problem. My view is also that one of the central problems is the capacity of human beings, of humanity, that we have learnt to modify human beings by genetic and other techniques, as well as everything else. And what harm will be done for it, I don't know. But it's really, it'll be a genetic equivalent of the old Murphy's Law. If it can go wrong, it will. So However, there's no question about it, whatever happens to the people who live there, the environment is essential, because without that, it seems to me to be unthinkable that the human race can carry on the scale on which it exists, as well as at the level at which of life which it exists in the 21st century. The real problem is, the crucial problem is, that it requires global solutions, but the one bit of globalization, the one aspect of life which has been totally unaffected by globalization, is politics. To this day, the only organizations which can take decisions, policy decisions and others, are states. Or alternatively, the organizations which have been given the go-ahead by states. And that's a problem. And we've seen this most recently. It may be that from time to time in crisis, states can be got to go together, although I don't see it happening very easily, even with the 27 states at present in Europe, let alone with the others in the United Nations. The last time this was done, at the end of the war, the Bretton Woods and all the rest of it, it wasn't actually done as a sort of universal decision. It was effectively done between the Brits and the Americans. It's possible that you might do it between Europe and the United States and China and India. Even so, it can't be done with less than about 5 or 6 participants now, and even that's going to be hard.
Thank you very much, Eric. Do we have questions, urgent questions for Eric Hobsbawm? We can take 2 or 3 questions.
I just want to ask you a personal question. You are, I'm told, we are told...
We can't hear it. If you can make the microphone here louder, that would be great.
We are informed over a period of time that you are a communist. Would you mind telling us whether that is the case, and are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you a supporter of the Communist Party? Maybe this is too personal, in which case don't bother to answer, but this question of communism certainly is a very important part of your life.
I've spent my life as a communist, and most of it as a member of the Communist Party. There is no Communist Party anymore in this country. There aren't any significant communist parties anywhere in Europe at the moment. There are still 1 or 2 in 1 or 2 places, mostly in Asia. I'm not talking about the official ones. So I think the question is, it is a movement which belonged to the 20th century as a movement, as a kind of organization. Essentially the Leninist vanguard party, which in its time was an extraordinary social invention and incredibly inefficient. Remember that within 30 years of Lenin getting off at the Finland station in Petrograd, 1/3 of humanity lived under the government of communist parties. But I don't think it works anymore. It's not likely to work anymore, and consequently, while I remain committed to the ideal for which Marx stood, and for which the ideal of a human and communally organized society, it's not possible to say that communist parties will play a significant part in it, there will develop other movements if this aim is to be achieved at all.
Do we have other questions for Eric Hobsbawm? Yeah, I see a question here. No? A question here.
Can you comment on the prospects of the new Latin American left, sort of 21st century socialism that we see rising?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Can you give some clarity to the rise of the 21st century socialism, as it's called, in Latin America?
The rise of socialism in Latin America.
Yes.
Could you comment on this?
This is one of the few very positive developments. First of all, I think it's new. I think the most important element of it is change in Brazil, and this is the first time that this great country has genuinely become a democracy in the sense that the people, what the people do or think, counts. How far it is socialism, how far it is a mixed economy which is now trying to emancipate itself from the supremacy of the United States is not yet clear. It's quite clear that the United States has lost its control over Latin America, which it exercised ever since, I suppose, well, in theory since the Monroe Doctrine, in practice, I suppose since 1914 or since the 1890s or 1880s. But it's great. It's all the greater because I think it is based around one large country which really has the possibility of turning at least South America into an independent actor on the world stage. And if that independent actor is an actor of the left, it seems to me that this is an entirely positive development.
Many, many thanks, Eric Hobsbawm. Many, many, many thanks.